teaching students. Welcome to this tutorial video in RE Religious Education under the topic called Suffering. So this is grade 11 work. So in this topic, we need to understand what is suffering, okay, how people suffer, different forms, kinds of suffering, what the Bible talks about suffering, and we'll talk about some questions to do with suffering. So this is your tutor, Mr. Ruben Jovo. So let's continue talking about suffering. Let's see. So suffering is experienced by all creatures. Suffering can be emotionally, suffering can be spiritually, it can be physically or mentally. So suffering, it is experienced by all creatures. The different types of suffering that we have in the world or in Zambia. If you lose a job, that's suffering. So losing a job is suffering. Being attacked, when you have been attacked, that's suffering. Sickness is suffering. Hunger is suffering. And poverty, this is suffering. Okay. So the people give comfort to the suffering by encouraging the person not to give up. How can you give comfort to someone who is suffering? They'll ask you this question in RE. Say, okay, so Mr. Banda is suffering from this. So what three advice can you give to that person who is suffering or who is in poverty? So you can give them advice by encouraging them not to give up, giving material or spiritual support, helping someone, giving them how you can manage what you can manage to give them, offering what you can manage, material or spiritual support. If you see someone is suffering, how can you help them? By giving them what they are lacking. Then the gathering to mourn. If, let me say, someone died, okay, how do people show or help or they comfort when someone is going through suffering? In Zambia, you follow that person's house, you go and cry together. Okay. You pretend, others you pretend to cry just to help, to comfort others. So by encouraging the person not to give up, giving spiritual or material support, and gathering to do what? To mourn for the person. So here are some of the pictures talking about suffering. This shows that there is poverty here going on. Children are not eating. They have no proper clothes to put on. Are you seeing that? The face shows that this person is hungry. So all these are forms of suffering. Person losing job, okay. Earthquakes, okay. Lightning, thunder, destroying things, that's suffering. Here, the same picture shows about suffering. So let's talk more about suffering. Explanation for suffering. In modern science, it says that it is because of the laws of nature. Say suffering, it is because of the law of nature. That's according to the modern science. But in Christianity, it says it is because of the sins. Christians, they believe that if a person is suffering, it's because of the sins that they committed. Before Adam and Eve sinned, there was no suffering. God allows people to suffer for reasons such as, so God, He allows people to suffer for the reasons such as to test and to purify people's faith. You can find this in a scenario that happened in the book of First Peter chapter 1, 6 to 7, where God was testing someone's test and the purity that someone has, okay, in faith. The other one, to punish people for their sins. Deuteronomy 28, 15 to 24. You find the passage that talks about God punishing people for their sins. Way back, what used to happen if a person sins, the ground will open and the earth will swallow you. That's how you will die. Okay, C, teach people so that they completely depend on God for everything. To teach people so that they depend on God for everything. D, because suffering is part of the cost of following Christ. Christians believe that if you are a Christian, you need to suffer because it is the cost of following Christ. Anyone who follows Christ must suffer the same way that Christ suffered. The other one, how you can explain suffering, is to discipline people and teach them. To discipline people and to teach them. In Zambian tradition, suffering is experienced by people because they have displeased the spirits or because they are hated by a witch. If a witch hates you, you will suffer. You will suffer. That's what Zambian traditions believe. If you are hated by a witch, you will go through hardship, you will suffer. That's what they believe in Zambian tradition. Okay, so explanation about suffering, what you're from talking about here. Okay, test for purity, punish for the people's sins, teach them completely so that they depend on God, discipline people and teach them. That's what you need to understand. So, what do you think are some of the causes of suffering? So, many people, these are the causes of suffering. So, many people believe that suffering does not just come, it doesn't just come, but suffering comes from a fallen world. So, causes of suffering, others believe that is because of the fallen world, community or evil such as prostitution, okay, drunkenness, crime, and corruption. These they causes suffering. And people can bring suffering on themselves because of their conduct. So these are the causes. People can bring suffering on themselves because of their conducts. And lesson 3. Okay. In this one, we'll talk about the avoidable suffering, some things that you can avoid. Okay, examples of avoidable sufferings are cholera, HIV/AIDS. These can be prevented. Okay, such as HIV. HIV can be prevented. This type of suffering can be prevented. How? By not having unprotected sex with an infected person. Okay, you cannot suffer from this. So, this is a virus that causes AIDS. This caused mainly by one having unprotected sex with an infected person, sharing contaminated razor needles, also through blood transfusions or infected blood from the infected mother by the baby. So people with HIV and AIDS, they suffer from common diseases such as malaria, coughing, and headache. So this type of suffering, it can be prevented. Okay. The AIDS, which is the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, though anyone can be infected with AIDS, often it's the victim, the people that are at high risk. So how can you know that a person is contaminated with this virus? Okay. So the symptoms, you find that the skin rash, there'll be skin rash. You even know this rash is different. Sweating at night, okay. The lack of appetite, prolonged fever, the fever that doesn't finish. So all these are sufferings that can be prevented. Can be prevented. So the prevention of this is just abstaining from sex, remaining faithful to your marriage, and avoiding using sharp objects, okay, with a person that is infected, avoiding such. Okay, so lesson 4 is talking about the effects of suffering. So each kind of suffering has its own effects on the victims and other people. AIDS, for example, has a lot of effects on individuals, community, and the national economy. People with AIDS are often shunned by neighbors, friends, and relatives. There are many ways AIDS is not spread. When you hold hands, you cannot get AIDS. Okay, shaking hands if you're not infected, if don't have any cut. Sharing knives and forks. Okay, playing with or hugging with a person who is HIV. By hugging, you can't get the HIV and AIDS. So let us check some examination questions on suffering. So some of the examination questions on suffering, we see how they bring questions. The first question is saying, I do not understand why Christians should suffer for the sake of Christ, wondered a church elder. I have been a Christian for 10 years, full of offerings, and I feel discouraged. He said, what Christians advise would you give to the church elder on why Christians suffer for the sake of Christ? State 3 points. So here are the answers. In RE, you don't answer in composition form. No, you always answer in point forms, neat with a good handwriting, and it must be visible. So here are some of the reasons why people suffer for the sake of Christ. What we are from learning: to test and purify their faith, to discipline or punish them in point form. It's a price that one pays for following Christ. To teach them to depend on God for everything. These were the answers in point forms. Okay, two, how can people in Zambian modern society avoid suffering? Give 3 points. Good moral standards can make you avoid suffering. Caring for the environment. Using drugs properly, you cannot suffer. Personal hygiene, obedience to God, populational control, and hard working. They believe that poverty sometimes comes by laziness. So if you're hardworking, you cannot suffer from poverty. And the last question is saying, how do people react to suffering in modern Zambian society? Give 3 points. People, they say suffering is caused by God. They blame God. They blame themselves. They blame others. Others, they blame others. Okay, perseverance, getting angry, okay, complain. Others, they pray to God. This is how people react to suffering. Others, they blame God. Others, they blame themselves. They blame others. Others, they just wait. They believe, wait it to happen. Perseverance. Others, they get angry. Others, they complain. And others, they pray to God. So this is what you need to understand about this topic called suffering and examination questions. So this is the unit that you needed to know. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. This is a professor. See you. God bless you.